Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads. This is going to be my Friday or weekend reads for this last weekend in August of 2019. The book that I'm midway through right now is Isabella Hammad's The Parisian. This is her first novel and is basically a fictionalized part of the life of her great-grandfather. The character does have the same name as her great-grandfather, and some of the life story bits are apparently true, so who knows how much of it is novelized and how much is family mythology. Once I'm finished this, I am going to look for more author interviews. Her great-grandfather was a Palestinian man who had been doing his schooling in Istanbul and then went to France for medical training or university, and went to France in 1914. And so you think about what was happening in Palestine at the time, which was under Ottoman control and would soon become under British mandate. And I believe that this ends during the British mandate, but you do have kind of the specter of it's going to be under Israeli control eventually. So it feels like this is going to be quite a bit more depressing than it is, and it is depressing because here you have this character who's in university during the First World War, and his French colleagues start disappearing eventually, in addition to the fact that there's a lot of kind of Orientalism in the French culture at the time. And it's somewhat about culture clash and culture shift and fall of empires, but it's also a bit soap opera-y. There's a lot of characters and interaction, and the character kind of reinventing himself as he moves within France and then goes back to Palestine. There's another character who is a French priest who's in Palestine, and there's a bit of the same thing in reverse with him. This is quite compelling, although I feel like there's maybe slightly too much description. This is the author's first novel, and I've seen interviews where she said that her next novel will be shorter and emphasizes that, so I think maybe the too much description has been a complaint she's heard a lot of, maybe. But I do find this pretty compelling. I will say I've had conversations on a couple of people's videos recently about code switching in novels and how it's often done poorly if lines are repeated in one language and then English if it's an English book. This does kind of the opposite in that it has a lot of language code switching. It's in English, but there are bits in French and bits in Arabic. And at first it seems like there's supposed to be some intent to that. So I initially thought that the bits that were in French were this main character misunderstanding something, and then it's clear that's not what's happening, or that the bits in Arabic are the priest misunderstanding something, but that's not it. And it's not natural places where in conversation you would switch. So it just seemed odd. It just felt like it was there for added flavor, but usually when an author does added flavor bits, they end up putting in a glossary, and there isn't that. So it just seemed like an odd choice. And because I thought there was some intent behind it, it was a little distracting at first until I realized, nah, this is just the way it is. And I mean, I thought that, and I speak French, and I don't speak Arabic, but I have a reasonable vocabulary. I like to say I can swear, pray, and count, which lets you get away with a lot. But I think if you didn't know any French or Arabic, it would be even more odd. But I think that is almost part of the same problem that is the excessive description of people and places. And I would almost say times, but I think the time bit is symbolic and part of the whole fall of empire bit, just because you have the 3 different calendars that are running it simultaneously at first. In any case, we'll see if my opinion of this changes once I finish it, but I would say it's quite compelling, but a little too descriptive in bits. So prior to that, I read John Steinbeck's Travels with Charley, which is his memoir of traveling with his dog across the United States. Some people like to point out that a lot of this is fiction and he didn't really travel alone with his dog. He wasn't really camping, he stayed in hotels, his wife was there for a lot of it. But I think complaining that this is, mismarketed as nonfiction, I think a lot of travelogues are fake, or at least lightly fake, because you're playing with memory, so I don't find that distressing, but if you're hoping for something that's absolutely nonfiction, this is probably not exactly that. This was written, I think, in 1960, so it is trying to capture that moment in time in the United States, and I found it really interesting to compare how things look today to how things looked in 1960. At one point he drives past a landfill and comments on, "Someday we're not going to want to see that." And I was kind of hilariously nodding like, yes, we don't want to see the big piles of pollution. But then he also talks about having these disposable frying pans that he throws in the water when he goes fishing. So I thought, yeah, he's not as advanced on that as he could be. But as someone who just drove kind of the opposite direction up the United States with my dog, I did quite enjoy this, regardless of how true it was. But I am someone who likes late Steinbeck. Like I always say, my favorite of Steinbeck's novels is The Winter of Our Discontent, and not the ones that you're supposed to like. So I thoroughly enjoyed this, but I know it's not going to be to everyone's taste. But I did think it was a really great portrait of that time. It's funny, I think I've talked about a couple of essays that are explicitly about socio-cultural tensions in the United States over the past couple of wrap-ups that I've done, but I think this did a really interesting job of presenting some of that, which again might be lightly fictionalized. It might be him presenting his own opinions, but I thought the bit where he has the three hitchhikers and they each have slightly different opinions on the civil rights movement, I thought that was kind of fantastic. So I do think this is worth reading, but be aware this was written in 1960, so some of it is going to be very dated and maybe uncomfortable. I think it's more interesting for being uncomfortable, and I enjoyed the dog. So. Last weekend was also the Get Graphic readathon, and since I'm usually reading a comic or two anyway, I thought I'd jump on the bandwagon. And I read another franchise book. This is, I think I talked about one of these either last week or the week before as well. This is Dragon Age Knight Errant. This is also written by Nunzio DeFilippis and his wife, who's his co-writer, Christina Weir, and drawn by Fernando Heinz Furukawa. This, again, has a similar writing style to the other book that I talked about, which mixes slightly cutesy faces with some realistic work. As stories go, I think this was better than Deception, but not as good as whatever that first one was called, I don't remember. Basically about an elven squire slash thief and her drunk war veteran boss knight that she follows around, and they go on adventures, and the main plot is them having to essentially being forced into doing a quest for the Inquisition, which if you're familiar with the Dragon Age universe, you know what that means. If not, I don't know why you'd pick up a franchise book like this, but I mean, hey, it is fairly self-contained, so I don't think it really requires you to know the universe, but it would be an odd choice. It does have Sebastian Vale from Dragon Age 2 and Varric from Dragon Age 2 and Inquisition, if you are particular fans of those characters. So yeah, this, as I usually say with this series, is good enough. There's nothing particularly spectacular, but if you like the setting and you want to see a fun romp set in it, there you go. Next up, I picked up a book of poetry, and that was If They Come For Us. This is by Fatimah Asghar, and I've seen this mostly described as being a set of poems about partition, which it really isn't. There are, I think, 7 or 8 poems in here that are titled Partition, and which are mostly about partition, but most of this is actually about being a child growing up in the United States in the kind of immediate post 9/11 world, and the fact that her parents died when she was quite young, and her experience growing up as an orphan in that particular setting. So I was surprised by this because, as I said, most of the reviews I'd seen seemed to be describing it as being about something that only about 8 of the poems were actually about. A lot of the poetry in here is very straightforward in terms of both the storytelling and the themes that it's dealing with. So I thought that the most interesting parts were the ones where she's playing with the words on the page. There's one called Map Home that takes the form of a crossword. So for example, across 6. You chased after a man and after a language that don't belong to you. 7 across. Clouded by these big words, keys to the mind and small words you collect in your palms. 1 down. He's everywhere now that you've said no. 2 down and spelled your mother's name wrong for most of your life. 8 across. Like here, the way your parents' names, small gifts show up in the mouths of the living. 3 down. Despite it all, there's a path that leads to love. And so on. So I thought that was great. There's another one here. It's called Script for Child Services, a Floor Plan, which, as you can see, has kind of an apartment or house floor plan on it, but in the background there's lighter text, and the lighter text repeats. Repeat after me. He is not a monster. Nothing happened. She isn't feeling well right now. That's why he called. Repeat after me, etc. And so that's down the back. And then each room has separate things. So bedroom 1. All orphans were raised by wolves. I called them sisters. We traveled as a pack, 3 to a bed, licking each other's fur. No one could hurt us. Kitchen. Is this how you bend someone's mind to break? Nothing happened. We were wolves. They said we could survive anything. So I thought that was all interesting. But there is quite a bit of standard poetry. which I will link to a video of her reading her own poetry, so you can get a feel of it, because it is stuff that flows very nicely, but because it was so straightforward, I was more interested in the bits that weren't straightforward. But if you're looking for straightforward poetry, there's certainly plenty of that in here. But I also read the first volume of Tramp, which is called The Trap. I read this through NetGalley, although it has already been released. It is another one of their BD translations. This was originally published in the 90s, and it is set in the 50s. It's a kind of maritime noir story in which an older man, his wife died during the war, his daughter has a disability that's not completely explained, but is implied to have been caused by whatever the same incident that killed his wife was. And so he's trying to do some kind of insurance scam that we find out bits and pieces, and his secretary and the captain that he hires have a bit of an affair, and mystery ensues from there. It is very gritty, and I would say isn't going to be something that's universally appealing because all of the characters are essentially unlikable. The receptionist is maybe the most likable character, but needless to say, in this kind of story, she does end up being raped and murdered at the end. I don't think that's a spoiler because this volume is a setup for the rest of the series. I think there are 11 volumes in this, but I believe that 7 of the 11 volumes have been translated into English. And the art is quite well done. I'll insert some of that here, and I'll insert all of the details below. I also listened to the audiobooks of a couple of memoirs this week. The first of which was Tiffany Haddish's memoir, The Last Black Unicorn. She's a comedian and now movie actor who's kind of hit it big over the past couple of years. And her early childhood was horrific. Her mother was horrifically abusive after a brain injury. Her father had abandoned the family when she was young. She was illiterate until she was 13. She had an abusive marriage. And she intermingles these stories of her horrific youth with a lot of the funny stories that she has already talked about in interviews. And the reason I picked this book up was specifically because I'd seen some interviews with her that were quite funny. But a lot of those stories ended up being the same ones, told in the same style, because this is her narrating the audiobook. So she's essentially doing her routine about things like, if you've seen interviews with her, taking Will Smith on a swamp tour, or having an old man die at a bar mitzvah party, and things like that. Interspersed with these horrific family stories, but also interspersed with stories about being a bit superficial. There's a bit of a story about a heavy-set person who is hitting on her. There's a story about a disabled coworker of hers that she had a brief affair with, but then she broke up with him just because she would be embarrassed to be with him in public, and there are bits of that. So it was tonally very odd. And she did write this with a co-writer. There's a co-writer credited on this, so it's not the case of, I think there are some celebrities who would write their own book and they're not much of an author, so it doesn't flow well. But as a comedian, she is essentially a writer anyway, and did co-write this. So the mixed tone of it was really weird. It was still interesting, but weird. Also, she's not very good at accents, which was funny because a lot of comedians are quite good at accents, but there's at one point the accent that she gives to her Eritrean father and the accent that she gives to the Jamaican woman that she's pimping out, actual story, are basically the same. So not great at the accents. And the voice she does for her disabled coworker is a little appalling, but in any case, I mean, if you're a fan of her comedy, it's probably worth listening to, and if you're not, it's not. So there you go. I'm also about 3/4 of the way through with Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, which made the rounds on BookTube about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago. It is basically half academic pretentiousness, talking about philosophers and quotes, pretentiousness that's just over the top, but mixed in with that is a very raw memoir of her relationship with the artist Harry Dodge, and in particular the fact that when they decided to have a child together, she was taking hormones for IVF and Dodge started taking testosterone at the same point, and when she fell pregnant, Dodge had breast removal surgery, so their bodies were changing at the same time. And she has some interesting commentary both about maleness and femaleness and identity, and how as those changes were taking place, their family was becoming more externally heteronormative looking. Like Dodge doesn't identify as male or female, although by virtue of having had breast removal surgery and being on testosterone does functionally become more male passing, I guess, eventually. And if you look on Dodge's website, it's funny because on the Wikipedia page, the pronoun used is they, but on the website and mostly within the text, it's all he. But there's a lot of that that's left open-ended, and there's discussions about the kind of open-endedness of identity. In between, here's what Freud said in philosophy, in between academic nonsense. And I mean, that's her shtick. I know she writes poetry and other bits of mixed genre nonfiction that are kind of odd. And it's kind of funny to me that this is the book that took off. I think she's American, and I think her other books were not even published outside of the United States. So this was one where a lot of British reviewers were saying this is her first book that's been published in the UK, blah, blah, blah. But it's an odd choice for a crossover. So, yeah. As I said, I'm not quite finished with it, but it's an odd book. The bits that are interesting, but some of it, there's a lot of eye-rolling. Because she does, when she gets into excessive sexual detail, I do kind of roll my eyes and think, you don't need to prove that you're so exciting to me. I don't need to know. And also, you don't need to prove that you're so academic to me with all these references. So maybe it's just not quite to my taste, but she is making a lot of interesting points within some of the oversharing and the academic stuff. Yeah, so that's where I am right now. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.